The umpires of open source software. Who decides whether something is open source or not? We're going to discuss that today. Plus, Back in Black. No, I'm not talking about the AC/DC song. I'm talking about GNOME and their decision to remove the translucent top panel effect in future releases of GNOME. Security researchers have discovered 2 new Linux backdoors, SpeakUp and Shellbot. Plus, what are the top 5 Linux distros for the new user? I'm going to share with you one article on that. Plus, new app releases, LibreOffice 6.2, Flowblade 2.0, and Green with NV 0.10. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And our first story on the docket here is Umpires of Open Source Licenses. This story is from opensource.com. It was written by Justin Dorfman, and as always, I'm going to link to all the articles that I discuss on today's show in the show description. So, this article is interesting because it basically, for those of you that are not familiar, what qualifies for open source and who decides whether something is open source or not, there is actually a foundation, a group of people that, I guess, oversee what constitutes open source and what does not. In the article here by Mr. Dorfman, he talks about, basically, he gives an analogy, a baseball game, where instead of using a pitcher, somebody drug out a pitching machine and put it on the mound, you would say, wait, that's not baseball, right? I mean, it's throwing a ball to somebody, but it's not really a human. It's not really a game at that point. You would say, hey, is this a joke? The same thing can happen with certain, quote, open source licenses. Just because the source code is available does not necessarily mean that software qualifies for the definition open source. For example, say I create a piece of software and I slap a free license on it, such as the MIT license or the Apache license, and my application becomes very popular and I realize I've never made any money off this application. How can I make some money off of it? Well, I decide to edit the license at that point and say, I no longer want to give you the source code. I mean, it'll be open source, but you know what? You have to pay me a fee if you want the source code. If you don't pay me a fee, you no longer get the source code. That would be very analogous to MongoDB's recent decision to enact their own license called the server-side public license, the SSPL. And basically, even though technically it is source available, the source code is out there, it does not meet the definition of open source by the people that really decide what is open source. Who decides? Well, the OSI, the Open Source Initiative. So there is actually a group of people, an organization out there that basically rules on this stuff. And a lot of people, even people in the open source community, people that use Linux and BSD and a lot of free and open source software, a lot of people in the general public especially, but also even people that use open source software really don't know what is open source software. They assume, hey, if somebody's got the source code available, it's hosted over on GitHub, it's open source. That is not the case. Just because something has the source code available and it's publicly out there and you can look at it does not mean it meets the definition for open source. For one thing, does that open source code that you can see on GitHub, does it have a license? If there's no license attached to it, some kind of free license like the GPL, the MIT license, the BSD license, the Apache license, something like that, if a lack of a license, absence of a license, by definition means it's not open source. So if it doesn't even have a license attached to that source code, technically it is not open source. For example, I have a GitLab page and I put all my dot files, all my config files, on my GitLab page for viewers of this channel to check out. If I don't add a license to it, technically you could say my dot files are not open source. They don't meet the criteria of the open source definition. What is the open source definition? Well, here in the article, they mention a few. Rights granted by a license, open source. And you see yes by everything. Basically, you have to have the ability for free redistribution. You have to be able to view the source code. There has to be no discrimination against persons or groups. This is where MongoDB's server-side public license failed. because it was very discriminatory. It has to have no discrimination fields of endeavor. And for real-world examples, Bootstrap, licensed under the MIT license, is very open source, and MongoDB, licensed under the SSPL, is not open source. You can get the source code, it's source available, but that does not mean it is technically what we like to call open source software. There is a definition for open source software, so if I go to the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, and you guys are interested in joining the OSI, I would strongly encourage you to do so. I recently finally joined the Free Software Foundation because I really appreciate the work they do. I probably should join the OSI as well. Anyway, they do have a resource page here for what constitutes open source software. They have a page here called the Open Source Definition, and there are, I believe, 10 criteria. Yes, 10 criteria that if your project does not meet, it is not open source. So, again, just having the source code available, that's just one of the criteria. Right? You've got 9 other things you really need to meet before you can truly say you are open source. The author of this particular article, some of the points he really stressed, especially here closing the article, were, notes to the developer community. So all of you folks that are in the developer community, a lot of people that of course watch my channel, a lot of you guys are, Linux enthusiasts, free and open source software enthusiasts. First, you need to realize source available does not equal open source. You also need to recognize that OSI approved licenses are the foundation of open source. The OSI has not signed off on a license that said, yes, this meets the definition of open source. It's not open source, right? You need to educate yourself on the open source definition, so make sure you check out the open source definition from the actual people that define open source, and familiarize yourself with the 10 criteria. And the second story on the docket tonight, back in black. GNOME has decided that they're going to ditch the translucent top panel effect that they've been using for a while now in GNOME and go back to a solid black top panel, similar to what they were using in those early versions of the GNOME shell. So, for those of you that are not familiar with the GNOME shell, basically right now, the top bar, it turns translucent when apps run in a free-floating window mode, i.e. none are maximized. This was introduced back in GNOME 3.26, and we're currently on, 3.30. 3.32 is actually about to be released, I think, in another month. So, it's been about 2 years that they've been doing this translucent top bar effect, but it has some problems. The big problem is text legibility. So, when you use a bright or a light-colored wallpaper, you can barely read the text on the translucent top panel. And they've asked the community, hey, come up with a solution. And quote from one of the GNOME devs, quote, nobody stepped up to address these issues in 2 years, so we're going to revert back to the fully opaque top bar. So it was actually a pretty neat effect. It was actually very attractive. I kind of liked the translucent top bar effect, but yeah, on a light wallpaper, it just didn't work. They asked the community for some options. The only options really were go back to the solid black background, which is what they're going to do. Try to implement some kind of blur effect, or use a lightness sampling to pick a foreground color, or maybe use a darker overlay with a gradient. So this bug report about the translucent top bar and the text legibility problems on light backgrounds, this bug report's been open for 2 years. No one stepped up to effect a suitable workaround, so the GNOME devs really say they have no other choice. They have to revert back to the solid black top panel. So what do I think about that? I think that's probably not a bad decision. The translucent top panel, while it can be attractive, they are correct. It didn't work in all situations. So starting, I think next month, we're going to get GNOME 3.32. It enters a beta actually this week. The final release, yes, is on March 13th. This is from Softpedia News, the announcement about 3.32 beta, the final release, will be in about a month. You're going to see the top bar. The top bar is now going to be solid black. It's no longer going to be translucent. Are there any other big changes in GNOME 3.32 that's coming up? Not really. We're going to see a little bit of a revamped default theme. and some new icons, but that's about it, or some minor icon tweaks, not really a new icon set. And the third story on the docket tonight, there are 2 new Linux backdoors that have made headlines in recent days. So I'm going to share with you 2 articles here from ZDNet. The first comes from February 4th. Security researchers discover new Linux backdoor named SpeakUp. And then on February 5th, Outlaw Shellbot infects Linux servers to mine for Monero. So let's talk about SpeakUp very briefly. So SpeakUp, basically, hackers have developed this new backdoor Trojan. It's capable of running on your Linux system. It's named SpeakUp. The malware currently is distributed to Linux servers mainly located in China. This particular backdoor, it is an exploit for the Think PHP framework, and of course it's designed to infect servers, probably web servers. So the Trojan takes hold of your system, right? So then the hackers can use it to modify a local cron utility. This gains them boot persistence. They're able to run shell commands. Once they can do that, they can execute files downloaded from a remote command and control server, and update or uninstall itself. So Checkpoint researchers were the people that first spotted this. They spotted this about 3 weeks ago. They say that SpeakUp comes with a built-in Python script that the malware uses to spread laterally through the network. SpeakUp can run on 6 different Linux distributions and the Mac OS. Of course, you don't see a lot of Mac OS servers out there, but those of us running Linux servers, we should be worried. Well, you shouldn't be that worried. Again, it seems to be mainly focused in China right now. China and the Think PHP framework. SpeakUp, so far, what it's being used for is to deploy Monero cryptocurrency miners. So it's all about mining for Monero, which is interesting because the following day, Outlaw Shellbot infects Linux servers to mine for Monero. So many of these recent Linux exploits, it seems all about cryptocurrency mining, right? It's about mining for Bitcoin and Monero and Dogecoin and so many of these other cryptocurrencies. I'm not that familiar with exactly how cryptocurrency stuff works, but apparently these hackers, they make good money at this by infecting other people's machines. By the way, the Shellbot story, there's a group out there called the Outlaw Group. The Outlaw Group, they're conducting this active campaign. They're targeting Linux systems, again, for cryptocurrency mining attacks. The campaign uses a refined version of Shellbot, which is a Trojan which carves a tunnel between an infected system and a command and control server operated by threat actors. This bot first emerged back in November 2018, so we've known about this one for about 3 months, although it's just now making headlines. I'm not sure who spotted it back in November. Anyway, the Outlaw Group, they knew about it. They're using it basically to mine for Monero on Linux servers. Shellbot is an IRC bot which is distributed through common command injection vulnerabilities which target not only vulnerable Linux servers, but also a variety of IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. In closing the article about the Shellbot, quote, the C2, which is the control and command server, it's still active and, quote, the botnet is growing. So Shellbot is out there just infecting Linux servers everywhere, mining for Monero. These stories are becoming just commonplace almost every day, right? We got one story on February 4th about SpeakUp. The very next day, Shellbot. This is getting out of control. And the fourth story on the docket tonight is the top 5 Linux distributions for the new user. Everybody likes to ask the question, hey, what is the best Linux distribution? Usually when they ask this, what is the best Linux distribution? They ask, what is the best Linux distribution, quote, for the new user? Well, one article writer here is going to give his top 5 Linux distributions for the new user. So this was written by Jack Wallen over at Linux.com. And just very briefly, I'll go over his top 5. The first thing we need to talk about is his top 5, exactly how he's ranking these. He is not listing the, quote, best user-friendly Linux distributions. No, everybody does that. What he's doing here, his defining line is whether or not Linux actually plays into the usage. Quote, in other words, could you set a new user in front of a desktop operating system and have them be instantly at home with its usage without any prior Linux knowledge? And I think that is a fantastic way to look at this, because that's the way I often look at it when I recommend certain distros to new users. I don't just, yeah, this is the best user-friendly Linux distribution. Well, it's the best user-friendly distribution maybe to me. But I come at it from, if I set my grandmother, who's never used Linux in her life, she's used Windows all her life, and I set her down in front of distribution A, will she instantly be at home, or will everything just feel kind of alien to her? That's kind of where I like to come at this, and this is where Jack Wallen is coming from here in his top 5, and the first one he lists is probably the first one I would have listed, to be quite honest. I often talk about how wonderful Elementary OS is for the new to Linux user, because it doesn't present you with a lot of options. It's not cluttered. It's not confusing to use. The fact that it is kind of Mac in resemblance. It's this walled garden. You can't do a lot of tinkering and tweaking with it, but that's great for the new user, right? That's exactly what the new user wants. The new user doesn't want to be overwhelmed like many of them are when they sit down in front of KDE Plasma, for example. No, the new user wants a very simple menu system, maybe a dock, easy to use panel with a sys-tray, and where can I launch the web browser so I can go view Facebook? That's what most new to Linux users want. Elementary OS is great, according to Jack here, because the designers have gone out of their way to create a desktop that is as simple as possible. I completely agree. He also mentions the fact that because the desktop resembles the Mac, it's not trying to beat you over the head with the fact that you're using Linux, right? It's not trying to be something different. It's trying to be something really quite familiar. And I agree. Elementary OS I think is one of the most important Linux distribution projects going today. Number 2 on his list is Deepin. Probably would have been my number 2. Me and Jack. I mean, we're like minds. Anyway, Deepin not only gets my nod for one of the most beautiful desktops on the market, it's also just as easy to adopt as any desktop operating system available. I would agree with that. I will say it is probably not as simplistic and easy to use as Elementary OS and the Pantheon desktop, but Deepin is easily the most attractive desktop operating system on the planet. I don't care, and I'm not just talking about Linux. I'm talking about you name it. Deepin is the most gorgeous desktop operating system on the planet, bar none. Deepin is very similar to Elementary OS in that they have their own custom apps. Elementary builds their own custom apps that are really built into the operating system. Deepin is the same way. Probably the highlight of the Deepin software suite is the Deepin App Center. The software center. It is simply the best GUI software center we have in Linux. Number 3 on Jack's list is Ubuntu. Ubuntu has to be on the list. Why? Because Ubuntu is, well, for one thing, it's the most popular Linux distribution on the desktop. Why is it the most popular Linux distribution on the desktop? Is because it's easy to use. It really was the very first Linux, well, it wasn't the first, but it was the first one that gained wide mass appeal that was very easy to install. So Ubuntu really mastered that 10-minute install, that 10-minute, you click OK 3 or 4 times in a graphical installer and you're done kind of install. So that really made Ubuntu gain a lot of popularity in the early days. Nowadays, what do I think about the default desktop environment on mainline Ubuntu? It's the GNOME desktop environment. I think Ubuntu does GNOME better than most. I really like the side panel, the very reminiscent of the old Unity dock when they used Unity. I like the colors, the icon themes. Again, GNOME, very much like Pantheon and very much like the Deepin desktop environment, GNOME is actually rather lacking in a lot of tweakability kind of features. It's the total opposite, again, of something like KDE Plasma. You're not presented with a whole lot on the screen, right? You have a dock, you have the panel, and you have, some applications pinned to the panel. And that's about it. Can you find your web browser? Yes, they can find the web browser. I'm telling you, your mom and your grandmom and your next door neighbor, if they've got an old Windows machine and you want to wipe it out and put Ubuntu on it, they're going to be right at home in Ubuntu. Number 4, Linux Mint. Linux Mint, the Cinnamon desktop environment. I'm assuming he's going to go with the standard Cinnamon desktop environment for Linux Mint. Very Windows-like. It has that old school Windows 7 kind of paradigm. Not my favorite paradigm as far as a desktop environment, but for a lot of people that if all they ever used was Windows and that's all they've ever used their whole life, Linux Mint is actually pretty comfortable, right? Number 5 on his, one of my favorite Linux distributions, Ubuntu Budgie. I'm just impressed every time I take a look at Ubuntu Budgie. The Budgie desktop environment really is what GNOME 3 should have been all along. Budgie is just beautiful, simple, not quite as heavy on resources as your standard GNOME 3 desktop. Here in the article, Jack mentions that Ubuntu Budgie is a little bit different than the other 4 on the list because its desktop environment, its default layout, really is not reminiscent of your standard Windows layout or your standard Mac layout like the other 4 we discussed. It's got the top panel and it's got the side dock. It's a little different, although I guess the GNOME desktop in Ubuntu is a little different as well. But overall, Budgie is just gorgeous. Again, I'm impressed with Ubuntu Budgie every time I take a look at it. Honestly, I kind of wish that Ubuntu would ditch the GNOME version of Ubuntu as the mainline version of Ubuntu and actually go with Ubuntu Budgie. It's that good. And the 5th and final story on the docket tonight. We've got some new app releases I just want to briefly discuss with you guys. So LibreOffice 6.2 was released with some UI improvements, security features, and more. The big new feature for those of you wanting to try out LibreOffice 6.2 is basically the notebook bar interface, kind of their version of the ribbon interface. The ribbon interface, you've been able to try it out in previous versions of LibreOffice, but it was kind of hidden. It was an experimental feature. If you wanted to test it out, there were ways you could do it, but now it's actually baked in as an option in LibreOffice 6.2. It's not turned on by default, but it's very easy to turn it on. So their new notebook bar interface, the ribbon-like interface, quote, the tabbed variant aims to provide a familiar interface for users coming from, quote, proprietary Office suites. So for those of you familiar with the ribbon interface in the Microsoft Office suite, you're going to feel right at home in the new LibreOffice 6.2 once you turn on the notebook bar interface. Also, Flowblade 2.0 is now out. Flowblade, I don't know anything about it. I actually have never heard of this project until I saw the release announcement for this a couple of days ago. It is a video editor, a free and open source video editor, which oddly enough, we do have a lot of these in Linux. There are, I could probably name a dozen free and open source software video editors available on Linux. The problem is, we don't have any really good ones. Kdenlive is probably the cream of the crop. It's what I use to edit all my videos and render all my videos. Kdenlive, pretty fantastic actually. For free and open source software, it's pretty amazing. But it's nowhere near professional grade, and I don't think Flowblade, I've never heard of it. I don't think it is as fully featured as even something like Kdenlive. But for those of you looking for another option for a video editor, Flowblade just saw a new release, 2.0. And finally, one more app. Again, I had never heard of this. I think it's rather new. It's seeing a lot of development in a hurry. It's like getting a new point release every couple of days, every time I check it out. As of, I think, 3 days ago, they were on version 0.10. This app is called Green with Envy. What is Green with Envy? Let's take a look at the screenshot here from OMG Ubuntu's release announcement here. Green with Envy, basically, this is so you can overclock your NVIDIA GPU. So if you use Linux, you own an NVIDIA card like I own an NVIDIA 1060. Got the proprietary drivers going and everything. This tool, this new NVIDIA tool called Green with Envy, designed to let me manage things like the clock speed and the fans and all that. Matter of fact, here's another screenshot. or the same screenshot, you can see the data it shows you. This is actually rather attractive, but it shows you GPU clock, mem clock, GPU temperature, fan, RPMs, GPU load, mem usage, and power draw. Really, really neat. Now, Green with Envy, they have a GitHub page. I checked out their GitHub page. You can install Green with Envy rather easily on pretty much any Linux distribution using a Flatpak. So you can find Green with Envy over on FlatHub. Now, for those of you that want to try out Green with Envy, like I said, you can overclock your GPU using Green with Envy. Don't do it unless you know what you're doing, because when you start overclocking your card, you could run into some real heat issues because it's going to start drawing more power. So if you overclock a GPU, you really need to make sure that you have more cooling, more fans in the case, or what have you. So be careful if you want to try the overclocking feature. Again, I don't recommend it, again, unless you kind of know what you're doing. And that was the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. This was Taking Into Account episode 28. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account sometime every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 29 sometime next Thursday. Usually I try to end these episodes reading a viewer question or comment on the channel, but for this episode, I wanted to make a brief comment. I made a video this past week about DistroWatch. DistroWatch had a decision to make regarding, they have a page called their Major Distributions page, where they list what they consider, I guess, the 10, quote, major Linux distributions, maybe based on importance or historical reasons or what have you. And they had Mageia on the list, and they wanted to drop Mageia because nobody really uses Mageia. It's not one of the 10 major Linux distributions. It never belonged on that list, and I made a video complaining that PC Linux OS was also on that list, and that they needed to drop both Mageia and PC Linux OS off the list, and that they should add Gentoo to the list. And I think a lot of people agreed with that. You saw some movement as far as people commenting on DistroWatch about, hey, yeah, get PC Linux OS and Mageia both off the list. Why is Gentoo not on the list? Well, a couple of days ago I noticed their major distributions page has been updated. Now their 10 major distributions page here lists Linux Mint. I still don't like that it's on there. Ubuntu makes sense. MX Linux. So they dropped Mageia and PC Linux OS. They added MX. Okay, if I don't think Mint belongs there, I don't think MX really should be there either. Arch Linux, yes. Gentoo, they added Gentoo. Thank you, DistroWatch. Why was Gentoo not on your major distributions page to begin with? It still blows my mind. Anyway, Slackware is here, Debian is here, Fedora, SUSE, CentOS. Can we swap out CentOS for Red Hat? Other than that, and then they added a 11th major distribution for a BSD distribution. They had to throw at least one in there. They put FreeBSD in there. So overall, I think that's a better list than what it was before. Still a couple of questionable picks, but I'm okay with what they went with there. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Dylan, Leo, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They are the producers of the show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. The show was also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen, all those names on the screen. They are the supporters of this channel. If you would like to support my work, please consider doing so. You'll find me over on Patreon. Please consider supporting DistroTube over on Patreon. Alright guys, peace.